as well check Adam Smith. Theory of moral sentiments, was that it? Anybody? Anybody ever studied? Have you ever heard of Adam Smith before? Yes, folks. Some consider him the founder of modern economics. Theory of moral sentiments is the other one. Of course, the problem and the reason a lot of people are concerned that no one reads the second book is because the first one is the one where we get the idea of how free market capitalism works, and his famous expression, the invisible hand, that there's this invisible hand that basically ensures that in a free market capitalist system, things are most efficient. You don't really understand how it works, but there's kind of some invisible hand that manipulates the market so that in a free market capitalist system, you end up with the most efficient means of production and the compatibility between what's available and what people are in desire of, etc. But the theory of moral sentiments is where you get the need for a society to be compassionate as well. So you can't just have a free market capitalist system, you have to have a society that basically uses funding in order to assist those that are not able to compete very well. In any case, it seems pretty clear from their connection and the kinds of things that David Hume and Adam Smith both said that Adam Smith was probably an atheist too, but didn't say it because he wanted the professorship, he wanted the job, whereas David Hume, who wanted the job, didn't have enough sense not to say certain things in public or in his writings. Which is why an interesting book by, I think, Daniel Rasmussen, no relation to our Rasmussens, is called The Infidel and the Professor. The infidel is David Hume, and the professor is Adam Smith. So, David Hume, Adam Smith. But, so we can at least see good arguments with David Hume arguing against the idea that God exists. We also see Ludwig Feuerbach is also, who's famous for being the inventor of humanism, has a particular sort of religion, actually, and that's Ludwig Feuerbach, which basically means a stream on fire. Feuerbach. Feuer is fire, Bach is a stream. That's why you could stream Bach's music if you like. Is that a good joke? Should I ever use that again? No. But Ludwig Feuerbach, who had a great deal of influence on Karl Marx and other so-called young Hegelians, that was what they called themselves, argued in his works on Christianity that man had invented God. Instead of God creating man in his own image, man created God in his own image. So he reverses that. But then on top of it, mankind generally attributes to God all sorts of superlatives. God is not just smart, he's omnipotent, omniscient, all-knowing, all-powerful, all-beneficent, all-good, right? So omnibeneficent, etc. And as a result of all of those laudacious things we say about God, there comes an equal, an opposite complaint that man is sinful, and all, stupid, all the other things, the opposite of what God is. And as a result, we feel absolutely miserable about our predicament, because we feel like since God is absolutely so fantastic, we're absolutely the pits. We're, as Martin Luther said, we're God's shit, basically. That's how bad we are, right? Of course, that's a Lutheran point of view. Not all Lutherans have that point of view, but if you read Martin Luther, he did. It's very negative that way. But so Ludwig Feuerbach has arguments against the existence of God, is clearly an atheist. Karl Marx, of course, and other members of their beer drinking or coffee drinking group were all atheists, although for different reasons. So not all of them just take everything that Ludwig said, but a lot of them come up with their own variants on it, etc. But Schopenhauer, who also had a great deal of influence on Nietzsche, was apparently reading The Will, The World as Will and Representation, Schopenhauer's major work. I was reading that Nietzsche was inspired and realized that Schopenhauer was saying exactly what he felt himself. And so Nietzsche is definitely inspired by Schopenhauer. And Schopenhauer is a pessimist, familiar with the Buddhist point of view, perhaps the beginning of Buddhism's entry into Western thinking through Schopenhauer's philosophy. In that sense, he's very pessimistic, clearly doesn't believe that there's a God, does argue, though, that there's basically a fate in the world, karma, if you think of it in the Buddhist terms, that is out to screw us, basically. The best laid plans of mice and men, all that problem. Because fate will turn around and bite us, etc. And remember, Wagner is heavily influenced by Schopenhauer as well, and writes themes into most of his middle to late operas that emphasize just how fate essentially gets us. Wotan has all his best plans to accomplish things, to get the ring back, etc. But instead, the gods are destroyed in Die Götter Dämmerung, right? The twilight of the gods. Parsifal is heavily influenced by a motif, although it's also considered a very Christian opera, perhaps the most Christian opera, if you're interested. Are you familiar with Parsifal? Probably not. Anyone? Okay. Annoy you for a moment with some Parsifal. It's 5 hours long. Let's watch it. Wow, you can download the whole thing or something of that. Let's just play the prelude. I won't play the whole thing, obviously. It's 15 minutes practically. So Parsifal is the son of the king who guards the Holy Grail, the cup that Jesus used at the Last Supper. Tell it's quite action-packed. That's how it begins. The main plot in Parsifal is that the king has been wounded by a witch who's evil, not a good witch from the west, or she's from the east, I guess. Doesn't have ruby slippers though. But she's wounded him with a spear. And by the third act, Parsifal gets a hold of the spear and uses it to cure his father, and they just destroy the witch's power. I don't think they actually kill her. Sink her in a lake or something. Whatever. And what enables Parsifal to succeed in this is Christian love. So it's not a big sword fight or anything. It's instead a matter of kind of a psychological thriller. How you use Christian love in order to overpower evil. So I'll just let that run for a while in the back to your annoyance. By the way, Wagner is famous for inventing lead motifs, or light motifs, however you want to pronounce it. L-E-I-T M-O-T-I-F, or V. And what those are lead. A lead is a little song, or a song. You know, sing mir ein Lied, right? Sing me a song. And so it's a song that is basically a meme, except motif was the word they used for it. And so he used these particular little melodies throughout his middle to later operas in order to represent a particular thing. So Siegfried's sword, Siegfried, the Nibelungens, Wotan has his own melody, etc. So everyone has their specific melody, and then the operas are basically all of these melodies kind of played together in a way that tells the story. So theoretically, you could follow along without even watching it. You could just hear the music and know which melody goes with which particular thing. The horn, Siegfried's horn, for example. The birds, fire has a particular motif, etc. So easily follow what's going on by just listening to the interplay of the melodies. And that was started by Wagner, but it's pretty much the rule for any music that you listen to that goes with a movie today. So for example, John Williams, when he writes his Star Wars themes, etc., there's like a Darth Vader melody, right? Boom, 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 right? So you've got all these melodies that you associate with particular individuals and so on. And so that's Wagner's. But Nietzsche is influenced by both Wagner and Schopenhauer, but he is clearly also influenced by other writings in his day. We could see this also as Freud later will also be an atheist, famously, grows up in a converted Jewish family. apparently has lots of abuse from his father, and as a result grows up hating both his father and the religion that his father represented. Right? And so he's an atheist as well, a rather famous one. In fact, I don't know if I told you, I remember in high school reading one of Freud's works. It was a requirement for us. The Future of an Illusion was the name of the title. And it basically, of course, is referring to the illusion of the religious dogma of Christianity, and I think Judaism as well, arguing that basically religion is false and just gives us an illusion of a future that is certainly not ever going to happen. So you're basically being a patsy. You're the one that sends in your $5 or $10 for two pillows or whatever that are the best pillows you'll ever have. Right? So that kind of thing. So maybe those are the best pillows you'll ever have. I don't know. So it's in vogue. Now some critics of Nietzsche argue that the problem with Nietzsche was that he was a Protestant. He was raised a Protestant. His father was a Lutheran minister, and as a result, he grew up believing the Protestant faith. And the Protestant faith leads you to want to explore the Bible on your own and think for yourself and interpret your own relationship with Jesus. And the problem with that is if you do that, you're not going to believe in any of that stuff. What you need to do is remain Roman Catholic and then believe what the Pope tells everyone to believe, etc., so that you know what the answers are, and you don't think for yourself, and that way you're confident that you know the truth, because after all, the Pope said it, and I believe it, right? So you're all set, right? Now the problem with Protestants is, of course, they think for themselves, and as a result, they end up thinking that nothing is true. There you see the problem, is that. By the way, there were a lot of commentators, even in the United States, that argued against Nietzsche, and people that would be reading Nietzsche in the United States arguing that your problem is you're Protestant. You should just stay Roman Catholic and then you'll be all set. Kind of interesting. By the way, there's a book by Pope John Paul II. Culture of death refers to the United States as living in a culture of death, not just the United States, but France. And who does he blame? He blames Descartes, René Descartes, because René Descartes in his thinking emphasizes the independence of the mind and focuses on our identity as an individual. So in a sense, John Paul II says, this is where this problem, this error in thinking enters into the Western culture and creates this modern self. And the modern self is an independent individual that has rights. No one ever thought of an individual as having rights before, but you, by the nature of your being human, have rights. And so we form a social contract. So the legitimacy of government is based on our votes. No one ever thought of that before, right? After all, it was God giving the power to the king, and the king giving power to his subsidiaries out there, the barons and so on, etc. So there's a clear hierarchy in nature as far as the tradition was. But thanks to the concept of the modern self, which evolves starting with Descartes and keeps on developing further and getting more and more elaborated, and of course ending up with people like Nietzsche arguing that in fact the ones that evolve by thinking of themselves this way and divorcing themselves from the authority so that they're no longer persuaded to believe whatever the authority tells them, they're the ones that become the Übermensch, the newly evolved next step of humanity, where you're no longer a sheeple living in that church, which is the tomb of the dead God. So what does Nietzsche mean when he says that God is dead? He's quoting from Martin Luther, and Martin Luther is quoting from the Bible, God is dead because we've killed him. And that's, of course, Jesus has been hung up on the cross to die because of our sins. So he's dying for our sins. So God is dead. We have killed him. But Nietzsche is interpreting it differently, even though he's quoting from Martin Luther. He's instead arguing that the reason God is dead is because, well, we've come to realize that we don't need to believe in the concept of God. It was always a fraud. It fooled a lot of people for a lot of the time, but now we know that it was a fraud. It never really referred to anything out there. Instead, it was just an illusion, just as Freud would eventually say. Right? It's an illusion to make us feel good. The opiate of the masses, as Marx says. Right? And we no longer need it because we've outgrown that childish crutch that we used in order to keep ourselves from being in a panic, because we didn't know why things happened the way they did. It was the God of the gaps, basically. We develop science, but we don't understand why lightning strikes, so we blame it on God. We don't understand why the volcano blew, so we blame it on God. But as plate tectonics and volcanologists figure out more things about volcanoes, we have cause and effect relationships. We no longer blame volcanoes on God's being angry with us, right? We no longer think lightning is Zeus throwing, lightning bolts at us because of our lack of sacrifice or whatever, right? So basically, we've given up on the gods. We no longer rely on them to answer our questions. The gaps that are left to be filled by God are getting increasingly smaller. If anything, we still feel like we wonder why there is anything instead of nothing. And the answer has always been, well, God. Why is there a universe? God created it. Of course, today we even have the answer, the Big Bang, right? And if you think of it this way, you don't pray to the Big Bang in the hopes that you will get a raise next year, right? That's not going to help. You don't pray to the Big Bang that you're going to get a job, or that you won't lose the one you have, or whatever, right? It doesn't make sense to refer to praying to a Big Bang, because it's just a physics concept, and the Big Bang doesn't have a care for us, right? A concern for us. So the interesting change in the vocabulary takes away the sense that God can be a personal God, that you can pray to God for things, and that God might actually be a person enough that it would listen to you and answer your concerns. So that was the end of the prelude to Parsifal. This is the prelude to Lohengrin, which was a much earlier opera. Okay. So, the death of God. Why were they so upset with God? Why did they argue that God doesn't exist? I would suggest that one of the main reasons was because they didn't like the authority that were arguing that God existed and telling them what God was like. So in that sense, when we think about each of those individuals that I mentioned, they're all very concerned about criticizing the authority that tells you the dogma that you ought to believe concerning God. When you get right down to the concept of the Big Bang, that's really God in just another word or set of words, right? Instead of God, you have the Big Bang, right, as the beginning of everything. When we read Joseph Ratzinger, who's also Pope Benedict the 16th. He's retired, resigned his position, which is a very unusual thing for a pope to do, but felt age had left him without the ability to really perform as he ought, so he retired, and that's why we have Pope Francis. But in that sense, since he took the name Benedict as pope, but his actual name is Joseph Ratzinger, makes you wonder now that he's retired as pope if he's now Eggs Benedict. That's a joke. By the way, when he was Pope John Paul II's right-hand man, they referred to him as the Pope's Rottweiler, which apparently is an evil sort of thing, because Rottweilers are vicious German dogs, but once he became Pope, they thought, oh, well, he's now our German Shepherd. Much nicer kind of German dog. Not really, actually, but everybody should be laughing hysterically at all this. This is hilarious. Oh, well. Okay, so Pope Benedict, in his books, and he wrote far more books than Pope Francis. When we look at his written works, I'll just explain. He basically describes our Trinity. If we refer to God as a Trinity, something Islam argues is why Christianity is a heresy, because God is one as far as the Islamists are concerned. Right? But if we think of it as a Trinity, what are we talking about? Of course, in the Creed, we're talking about God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Spirit or Ghost, right? And so what are those, and how can you even think that this is one thing if you've got three separate things? And the answer is, well, we have from Joseph Ratzinger, Pope Benedict, is that we have three different needs when we're thinking about the nature of God. The one need is that beginning, the Big Bang. What started it all? Why are we here? Why is the universe here instead of nothing? Right? And that question basically gets resolved by escaping the question, which is why a lot of people criticize it, by saying that God did it, right? And so the criticism of course, is that, well, but that doesn't answer the question. If physicists are going to be able to try to figure it out by doing mathematics regarding the very, very beginning of this, how essentially nothing all of a sudden blew up into being a full universe, a singularity in the middle of nothing, and was so compressed that all of a sudden there we have it, an explosion, right? Well, they're using physics to try to figure it out, but actually that's not a whole lot different than any other approach that historically man tried to use in order to figure out why the beginning occurred rather than nothing. And it was just referred to as God. So in that sense, we might say that physics in that sense is really being what theology always had been, trying to figure out what's the beginning. of things, right? So that's one concept that we need when we're talking about the concept of God. Theologians are trying to figure out what the nature of God is. The second one, however, is that one that gives it a personal relationship. And so the concept of Jesus as the Son of God can be viewed not only in, say, the physical sense that some relationship between God and Mary resulted in her having a physical son that grew up and was essentially somehow God, and always had been. So you have to be careful. You have to play the word game to make sure that you're not believing in multiple gods like Zeus and his various children and so on. How many children did Zeus have altogether, by the way? Anyone know? I think it was hundreds. However, if we think of God, and remember they say God's only son, right? That doesn't help. But in any case, how do you play this word game so that on the one hand you believe in only one God, it's a monotheism, but at the same time you have this personal aspect of the divinity who's a human. And the idea, of course, can be interpreted in many different ways. By the way, the church, of course, steps in and says, this way is a heresy, this way is a heresy, this way is a heresy. You get burned at the stake for this, thinking this, for thinking this. We'll have wars in France over this argument, etc., right? But if you think, what are they trying to do? They're trying to figure out this logical puzzle of what's the best way of saying that God and Jesus are one. But at the same time, you don't pray to God as the Big Bang for favors, but Jesus you could talk to as a person. I remember as a kid growing up in church, and I was taught to pray and talk to Jesus, or talk to Mary. You get to talk to Mary too. And that's pretty handy, by the way, because if you pray to Mary, she's the mother of Jesus. So if you convince her to bet for you, she'll go to Jesus and make sure that he does whatever you've asked her for, right? So that's a step up when you get on Mary's side, right? But in any case, that gives you a sense that the divine is personal, that you have a relationship to the divine, that you're not just basically being middle fingered off by the divine nature of the universe, which is what a lot of non-Christians argue, right? That God created the world. It's perfectly fine to believe that God existed, exists, is still there, runs things, set the clock in motion, whatever. But boy, if you think you can pray to God and ask him for special favors, you're just being dumb, right? Well, but it's not that way if you believe in Jesus, because Jesus is a person and has a relationship with you. So that satisfies a second need, and that need is for us to feel that the universe cares for us. The universe loves you. Right? And the reason the whole universe is here is for you. Wow. That makes you feel so special. And it certainly does, right? The reason the universe is here. Now, I might not understand it, right? There's all sorts of things that seem like they're not going in my direction. But believe, and eventually you will see that Jesus has good intentions, so that everything that happens to you is all for a special reason down the end, right? So follow that train of thinking, and you could see that even when things go bad, even when you have a plague, even when you have a Holocaust. One of the things, if you ever read Elie Wiesel, the survivor of the Holocaust, who's written many books, argues that God wasn't there at the Holocaust. So it's interesting. A lot of survivors of the Holocaust came away losing their belief in God because they couldn't think God existed and allowed such horrendous things to happen. Although others, like Eli Wiesel, argue that God still exists, he just turned his head, didn't watch. He was not there for that. There are others, though, that are absolutely furious with God. Perfect example of that is
May abundant peace descend on us. Amen. Great God, you who make peace in the high places, who commanded the morning since the days began, and caused the dawn to know its place, surely you can cause and command a touch of order here below, on this one day's speck. Let us say again. Amen.
Beautiful music, by the way. There's a requiem that was played at the newly rebuilt, destroyed cathedral in England after World War II, written by Benjamin Britten, that is also absolutely horrible to listen to. Of course, the point of the music isn't, this is music to sit and study by. No. This is the kind of music where you go to an event and listen to it. You concentrate on what's being said, what's being sung, and the music goes with it and creates the feeling of horror, that things are absolutely miserable on the earth under these circumstances and so on. Do things improve? It's left, of course, in doubt, right? So you can see a lot of individuals that survived the Holocaust, World War II, other horrible events, some of whom totally lost their faith, others that kept their faith but are absolutely horrified by God and say things like C.S. Lewis when he says in A Grief Observed, that this doesn't make me feel like God doesn't exist, but when things like this happen, what worries me is that this is what God is like, that when we knock on the door and ask for his help, there's no answer. He just ignores us. Not that he's not there, but that he just totally ignores us. We're not important to God. That's a horrible sort of feeling. Instead of thinking that God cares for you, you're the center of the universe. You're why everything has been created, just so your life unfolds the way it does in your social environment. So obviously you're not alone. You're part of a community, and as part of that community, everything is, what's centered around you is still a communal event. So it's not just for you, but you're the focus. You're the focus of God's universe. So Benedict gives us two different explanations for why we talk about God. And the third one, the Holy Spirit, is that social milieu that essentially is the Spirit of God among us. So if you think of it that way, it's the memes, the cultural rituals, the language that we use that you've learned from your peers, and it certainly evolves. By the way, Pope Benedict is, number one, I think a Hegelian, clearly accepts the idea of social progress and so on. They certainly argue, yes, of course, during things like the Crusades, the church was absolutely vicious, fought against others, burned people at the stake, etc. But the church has evolved, along with our understanding of the nature of God, right? Has evolved. It still is, right? By the way, Pope Francis, in being much more ambiguous in a lot of his descriptions of things, instead of being the hard-line Pope Benedict, but instead opening up possibilities. So, perhaps someone who's been divorced can come back to the church. Perhaps someone who's gay can be accepted into the church, perhaps, etc. Right? So he's not actually saying that it is, because the hardliners would be upset with him, but he's leaving it open, which is a heresy, an Arian heresy, according to some. So it's kind of interesting to have the Pope considered to be a heretic when, after all, he's supposed to be the church leader. Among the critics of religion today, we have the famed four so-called horsemen. So we've got Richard Dawkins, not Dawson. And we've got Christopher Hitchens, Daniel Dennett, and Sam Harris. And they're referred to as exemplars of the new atheism. And here's the four of them having a chat.
One of the things we've all met is the accusation that we are strident or arrogant or vitriolic or shrill. What do we think about that?
Yeah, well, I'm amused by it because I went out of my way in my book to address reasonable religious people, and I flew the draft with groups of students who were deeply religious. And indeed, the first draft incurred some real anguish And so I made adjustments and made adjustments. And it didn't do any good in the end because I still got hammered for being rude and aggressive. And I came to realize that it's a no-win situation. It's the mug's game. The religions have contrived to make it impossible to disagree with them critically without being rude.
Without being rude.
You know, they sort of play the hurt feelings card at every opportunity, and you're faced with the choice of, well, am I going to be rude, or am I going to articulate this criticism? I mean, am I going to articulate it, or am I just going to button my lip?
Right. Well, that's what it is to trespass is taboo. I think we're all encountering the fact that religion is held off the table of rational criticism in some kind of formal way, even by, we're discovering, our fellow secularists and our fellow atheists. You know, just leave people to their own superstition, even if it's abject and causing harm. I don't look too closely at it.
Now that was, of course, the point of the title of my book, is there is this spell and we got to break it.
But if the charge of
This is Daniel Dennett
offensiveness in general is to be allowed in public discourse, then without self-pity, I think we should say that we too can be offended and insulted. I mean, I'm not just in disagreement when someone like Tariq Ramadan, accepted now at the high tables of Oxford University as a spokesman, says the most he'll demand when it comes to the stoning of women is a moratorium on it. I find that profoundly much more than annoying.
Right, yeah.
Insulting, not only insulting, but actually threatening.
But you're not offended. This is, you don't take any, I don't see you taking things personally. You're alarmed by the liabilities of certain ways of thinking. That's in Ramadan's case.
But he would say, or people like him would say, that if I doubt the historicity of the Prophet Muhammad, I've injured them in their deepest feelings.
Right.
Well, I am, in fact, I think all people ought to be offended, at least in their deepest integrity, by, say, the religious proposition that without a supernatural celestial dictatorship, we wouldn't know right from wrong. That we only live by.
Are you really offended by that? Doesn't it just seem wrong?
No, I say only, Sam, that if the offensiveness charge is to be allowed in general and arbitrated by the media, then I think we're entitled to claim that much without being self-pitying or representing ourselves as the oppressed minority, which I think is an opposite danger. I'd also that I agree with Daniel that there's no way in which the charge against us can be completely avoided, because what we say does offend the very core of any serious religious person. Anyway, if we deny the divinity of Jesus, for example, but maybe it will be terrifically shocked and possibly hurt. It's just too bad.
I'm fascinated by the contrast between the amount of offence that's taken by religion and the amount of offence that people take against really anything else, like your artistic taste, your taste in music, your taste in art, your politics. You can be not exactly as rude as you like, but you can be far, far more rude about such things. And I quite like to try to quantify that, to actually do research about it, actually test people with statements about their favourite football team or their favourite piece of music or something, and see how far you can go before they take offence, compared to, is there anything else, apart from, say, how ugly your face is, that gives such...
Or your husband's or wife's or girlfriend's.
Yes.
Well,
so, looking from the left, Christopher Hitchens was a journalist, wrote for Vanity Fair and a few other magazines, and also wrote books. God is Not Great, for example, is one of his books that he wrote, basically criticizing all religions, belief in God. Daniel Dennett, the one that I try to emulate the most, although I did trim my beard this last weekend. He, I think, is the most serious one to contend with, because he actually agrees with the idea that if you talk about God in the abstract theological sense, of course God exists. He said that in an interview with Charlie Rose quite a few years ago. But what he's, of course, arguing against in his various books is the way that people in fundamentalist societies believe in the nature of God. Richard Dawkins is also a biologist. His first most important book was The Selfish Gene, which of course avowedly is not trying to argue that genes have personality, etc. Although it was funny, after his book, The Selfish Gene, there were other books like Mean Genes, The Altruistic Gene, so that other people jumped on the same kind of bandwagon, started classifying genes by personality types, which is pretty silly. But as a biologist, he's a great biologist, really interesting books on biology. And Sam Harris, I'll mention him before I kind of say why all of them jumped on this anti-God bandwagon. But Sam Harris studied Buddhism in India, came back, was graduated as a philosophy major, but then went into neuroscience, so he's a neuroscientist, and very interesting, the youngest, obviously, of them, and has his own podcasts on the internet, which you could listen to, where he interviews different people. I think I mentioned his podcast with Charles Murray earlier this semester. But so all four of them worked together, basically, at least until Christopher Hitchens died, trying to insult people that believe in religion, believe in God. And the idea that they had was, if they insult people that believe in God in these fundamentalist ways, then fewer people will come under the influence of religious imams and others that encourage their followers to be vicious, to non-believers. So basically, what started this was the attack of 9/11 in the aircraft that crashed into the buildings in New York and the field in Pennsylvania and the Pentagon, right? So their feeling was the way they could combat that kind of fundamentalist terrorism was by embarrassing people, using science to argue that basically science is the only way to look at the world. Religion is passé, it's medieval, and all the things that come out of religion are bad for you, right? So that was their approach, to try to absolutely insult people. So here they are actually trying to discuss how do you insult people enough to keep people from joining religions and believing in it without them getting too mad at you because of how upset you get them over the things you say about their faith, etc. It's kind of an interesting discussion. The only one I've actually met in person, by the way, was Richard Dawkins, who a few years ago gave a speech up at Fairbanks at UAF. And I got to go up, that was during the summer, so my wife and I hopped into the camper and drove up to Fairbanks just so we could be there the next day when he gave his lecture. And she knew I was excited to go see him. She hadn't read his works, however. She had just read his biology books. I think she would have been fine with that. But of course, I've collected lots of his other books. And we got up there and he started his speech, and there were about 400 people in the auditorium there, and it became basically an atheistic church ritual with him pushing the lever, getting worse and worse, and watching how the crowd reacted and cheered him on. And so, eventually people were standing up and cheering, atheistic kinds of feelings. And at that point, my wife smacked me, because of course she was horrified that I didn't warn her what things were going to be like. And I was sitting there just absolutely amazed because it was like a church service for atheists. So my feeling, of course, is that these folks are actually very religious. In a sense, their religion is a religion of atheism. You're not a believer unless, of course, you're an atheist. Right? You're not saved unless you're an atheist. So join the throngs of the saved by becoming a bright, for example. Daniel Dennett refers to them as brights. Actually, he didn't invent the idea of the brights, but he was asked if it was okay if he was part of it, and he said yes. So when you look at Daniel Dennett, and the brights, there's the brights movement. So this is even more reason to think of this as kind of a religion in a sense. Remember that my definition of religion, which you can go down to my notes, and that's one that I have under other items. And what is religion? I still haven't fixed the page. But basically, I define religion as belief in a meta-narrative or a story. And science is a meta-narrative. So literally, your faith could be in science. By the way, there's various scientific meta-narratives. So for each of the different evolutionary theories, those are, in a sense, a meta-narrative. And so there's multiple examples of scientific meta-narratives. And you could feel that you're part of a group, and you could feel like your fellow believers are all part of your inner circle, etc. And you're saved because of your beliefs, etc. So in a sense, there's all sorts of sociological things about the nature of religion that fit practically anyone. So I wouldn't say that some person is religious and the other person is not. It's instead the case, I think, from a sociological perspective, that everybody is religious, some more religious than others, depending on their willingness to be open-minded, perhaps, right? But basically, what you've got is a need for everyone to have a meta-narrative that gives them a sense of their roles, the things that they believe are true, etc., right? So in a sense, we're all religious. It's just, what religion are you, right? There's lots more out there than simply the mainline religions or the traditional narratives. Nietzsche himself, in a sense, is a religious person, very religious, very enthusiastic. All sorts of special adages that he uses in order to promote his set of beliefs. For example, God is dead. Unless you agree with me, you're not saved. Right? That's hilarious, I think. However, and by the way, this page I have lots of arguments about why the definition works that way. I define a religious person as someone who has faith in a meta-narrative. And so religion would be defined as faith in a meta-narrative. And the stronger the faith, the more religious the person. And notice, they do not have to be traditionally associated with a religious institution. And as people mature, they gradually go through various meta-narratives. So basically, the meta-narrative you learn as a child is the kind of belief you believe as a child. Right? And then as you get older, you have to put away those childish things and begin believing in the more adult things. You have to start adulting, right? We say all of that. So that's pretty cool to think of it that way. Some of the changes in our beliefs can be quite traumatic. Nietzsche certainly was. So when you read about him, you read about how traumatic an experience it was for him in school as a kid to be reading philosophy and come to realize that he no longer could believe in God, the God that his father believed in. And it was because he's angry at the things that God had done, the way God treated his father, for example, essentially destroyed Nietzsche's faith, etc. Right? And he convinced his sister Elizabeth to believe in his view of things, and she became a follower of his. Right? So there's all kinds of interesting things that way. Now, in the syllabus, the link I have here is to the dialogue between one of those four. Oh, and it's gone. That was, but you could find it. I'm pretty sure they might have just broken it up. Richard Dawkins and Alistair McGrath. So there would still be. Oh, is that the one that's not there?
Alistair,
No, there it is.
for an apologist for religion, to be able to say that you once were an atheist gives you
The main reason I have this video posted there, most of the people that Richard Dawkins talks to, he just insults like crazy.
Well, I think when I was growing up in Northern Ireland,
It belittles them because most of the people that argue with him are not really in his league.
And certainly, I think growing up in Northern Ireland, you see how easy that
And so
was
he
to
insults
educate.
them.
Back in
And
the
that's part of
1950s, of course,
those
everybody was a
four
Marxist,
of them
and I followed
trying to
the
insult
fashion.
people
And
that
it just
believe
seemed
in the
entirely
traditional
reasonable to
religions,
adopt an atheist
especially the
approach. And of course, at the
fundamentalist
time, I was
version,
studying natural
so
science
that
and
people
wanted to
will
go
no
to
longer
Oxford.
be
And
inclined
then
to
just
join
thinking
and
that
follow
society
those. If you
atheism
listen to
almost
him,
like rolled into
you'll
each other
feel
in a
like,
very
why would I be
interesting,
such an
satisfying
idiot?
way.
And
I think
believe
when I
what
arrived
that
at
guy
Oxford, I
says.
began to
I'll
rethink
go
things.
with
I began
Richard
to realize
Dawkins
they weren't
instead,
perhaps
Professor
as straightforward
Dawkins, right?
as I thought.
Well, in this particular
And certainly
video,
at
you
that
have
point, I
Alistair
really began to
McGrath,
see the Christianity
who
offered
is a
second way
colleague
seeing things
of
and
Richard
making sense of
Dawkins,
things
and he's
than
a
I'd imagined in the
theologian,
past.
plus he's a
This is sort of coming
biologist,
to the end of
the
a very
same as
long
Richard
period of
Dawkins.
interviewing people. And in
Plus,
America
he's studied
and in
other things. He has 3
Israel,
PhDs, so 3 times
I've
the
interviewed some
academic
very,
weight of his
with
colleague,
odd bedfellows, as it were.
Richard Dawkins. And so
I
Richard
thought I'd give
Dawkins
you the
treats
opportunity
him
to say
as a
something
colleague, and their discussion is very
I've interviewed people who said, I'll believe in evolution when I see a monkey give
amicable,
birth to a
right? They're
to a
not
man.
going to insult
Or,
one another.
I've
And
interviewed
he ends up
somebody who thought
concluding,
it was
along
right
with
to
Alistair
adulterate
McGrath, that the kind of God that he's been insulting, the belief in God, is really not the theologian's concept of God. But remember, that is especially annoying to folks who grow up believing all sorts of things about God, and then the theologian comes along and points out that absolutely God exists. God is that than which nothing greater can be thought. But at the same time, as a result of that definition that everyone who studies theology accepts as their starting point, right, turns out, well, but then you can't say anything else about God. You can't say God is this, that, or any of those other things. So basically, they're very close to being an atheist in the sense that you can't describe what God thinks, etc. It's open then for you to dialogue over what sort of things you think God values, right? So in that sense, the real issue then becomes, what is our highest value? And by saying you believe in God, you're given your ticket to enter into the discussion, right? If you deny that God exists, what point is there in your being part of the discussion? But if you agree that God exists, then you're allowed in, basically, and then you can participate in the argument over, well, what values would be those that we would say are divine? Is love something that works that way, or is that in conflict with things like God is red in tooth and claw, the lex talionis of the Romans, right? Right, the talon, right? The law of the talon, that is often translated as what is it that's red in tooth and claw? I forget now. That's nature, right? It's kill or be killed, basically. That doesn't sound like Christian love when you say that that's the nature of life, right? Etc. Would you say that love should be our highest value? Does that sound like a good quiz question? Would you say that love should be our highest value? It is the highest value. But then how do you resolve that conflict when you say that, okay, I love my rabbits. I've got all these, no, I don't really have rabbits. But say I'm raising rabbits. I've got cages of rabbits. And everyone thinks, wow, look at his rabbits. He's got all these rabbits. What am I raising the rabbits for? To eat them, right? I'm going to eat these rabbits. You know, oh, look at this cute bunny. This is George. This is Gertrude. You know, before we eat them, we're going to have lots of little Georges and Gertrudes. You know, so that I have another crop for next year, right? You know, so I love these rabbits because they're delicious, right? Right. Is that the way nature is? Is that what Jesus meant by saying love your neighbor as yourself? You know, that's, I don't eat myself. Should I be eating my neighbor? Is that really a good idea? Who's your neighbor, you know? And, you know, does that make us cannibals, etc.? So, would we say that love is the divine? That's typically viewed as the Christian principle. That what Jesus came to reveal to us is that the universe loves us. The universe loves you. That's the revealed word of God according to the New Testament, that God loves you. And that Jesus is the exemplar of that. Which of course causes conflict, because when Jesus goes to the temple and beats the crap out of the money lenders, right? You know, overthrows the tables, etc. That doesn't seem like love and affection, does it? You know, as he's taking a whip to people and beating them out. You know, that's revolution in Judea, right? So there, of course, are conflicts there. How do you resolve those conflicts? Is this all fun? So next class, we're looking at Anthony Kwame Appiah on identity. And we also have a video with Christina Hoff Sommers. It's not just her. Be careful. This is actually a video of a panel, and Milo is absolutely horrific. I highly don't recommend that you pay too much attention to Milo because he's absolutely insulting to the crowd.
Hello, everyone.
So I picked this not only because Christina Hoff Sommers is there, but this is an interesting example of just where we shouldn't go with discussions. This is a horrific example. This is one of those that shows the problem we have in some universities over freedom of speech today, in that sense. But of course, this is all part of identity politics. What happens if you're gay? What happens if you're a lesbian? What happens if you're ugly? Etc. There's an interesting article just the other day about 3 girls in a high school that were absolutely insulted to find out that the boys in the high school were rating the girls according to how attractive they were. And they thought that was absolutely insulting. Instead, we should get rid of this male environment, so that we don't have, males rating women based on how attractive they were, etc. I was puzzled over, well, but that is part of nature, isn't it? Isn't that the way all young males behave as they start becoming aware that girls are different, etc. Maybe. Interesting. But that's, of course, identity politics still playing itself out even there. Right? So, any questions? Was this fun? Was this repetitious? Did I put some of you asleep? It looks like at least one person's. Oh, no, you're. Because I wouldn't want you like waking up and falling over the railing, and once you, before you knew where you were. Pardon?
So you need like a t-shirt stand to break people off.
Au revoir. Au revoir. So what's wrong with this device? I don't want to blow your ears out. Have a good weekend. Be safe. Pray for flowers.